So this kind of brings us to a third point, which we've already started to touch upon, how order goes to chaos and chaos comes from order. So you have to think of this as a never-ending cycle, and so order comes from chaos, chaos comes from order. And the tarot card for me that depicts this perfectly is, of course, the Wheel of Fortune. This never-ending cycle of change, consistency, and then change in all aspects of existence, right? So we've talked about some of the mathematical, evolutionary, and scientific ideas behind chaos theory.
The ideas of chaos and order are very old.
They're very
Let's not
ancient
forget
principles.
the world is...
Yeah, let's not forget to think that Western European history is a history of the world. Basically, it's not. So that kind of brings us, we already talked about illusions of absolutes. We talked about the Newtonian paradigm, the limits of it, and how it's dangerous to think just in terms of the Newtonian paradigm. And
but it's also like a lesson from magic that you can learn.
exactly. This illusion of absolutes.
You're the expert.
I've talked about this book before, The Flame and the Cauldron by Orion Foxwood. And I'll have to do a review, just a video dedicated to this book, because there's even though it's fairly thin and looks like a book you can get through in a day, it takes time to digest it. Because he kind of dives into the philosophy of witchery, of old style witchery and witchcraft. So I'll have to get into that later, but one of the parts of this book that was very eye-opening to me is when he talks about the 4 illusions, and I've mentioned this in a previous video, the part 2 of How Did I Know I Was a Witch video, at the very end. And he says there's 4 illusions, which are basically, especially in Western society, we're just stuck on these illusions, and if we keep going with these illusions, we're just going to destroy ourselves. So the illusion of isolation, so too much focus on the individual, too much hyper-individualism, as I call it. The illusion of control, this idea that I can control outcomes and I have to control my environment to feel safe, which is related to the 3rd illusion, the fear of change. So that system of order to chaos to order to chaos to order to chaos, the only constant is change, as the old saying goes, and yet we fear change, right? Which goes back to the whole need to control everything to feel safe kind of thing. But the last illusion is very eye-opening for me. It's this need, this dependence on absolutes, the modern Western scientific paradigm is reality, or Christianity and the Christian God, or
it's the only way
is
to
the
see
only
divinity.
truth. It's the only way to see divinity, and that can be said. I call these monotheistic paradigms, and it's not just the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Those are obviously monotheistic, but also the scientific paradigm. This assumption that there is an absolute truth and an absolute reality.
And you can measure that.
And that it's measurable.
If you observe enough.
And that's the Newtonian paradigm. This need for absolutes, it reminds me of something you told me once about radical constructivism.
Oh.
Do you want to touch on that? In education, there's a theory or a line of thinking called radical constructivism.
But probably it's been used in education, but it's used in many different fields, also in psychology. I think also in social science.
Right.
So radical constructivism, and by the way, I'm not saying that you should like take these theories and like follow them right 100%.
Right.
The idea is like use as many theories as you need to like explain yours. So radical constructivism, one of its principles is the question of reality. Does reality really exist or not? If reality exists or not, like there is one true reality, it doesn't really matter because we're unable to know it.
Right.
So the discussion if it's that there is this true or not thing, the unique truth, it's just it lost its value because in order to, even if you assume that there is one true reality, in order to know that reality, you would have to have access to it independently of your
Subjective experience.
subjective experience or what is it called? Your senses,
Right.
right? Have like the idea of like I don't know, this book really exists here, right? This book really exists. So in order to know that, I don't have to step away from my senses, and that means like touching, like smelling the book, looking at the book.
Yeah.
So stepping away from my senses, taking the true book, right, and comparing it with my perception of this true book, which is clearly impossible because you cannot step away from your senses.
Yeah, you can't step out of your subjective experience.
Exactly.
So then the student who is kind of pushing against the idea of radical constructivism would say, so does this mean that this table doesn't exist even though it's right here? You know, the point is not arguing whether or not the table actually exists. The point is, even if there was one true, measurable, objective reality, it's impossible for us to have direct access to it because we're always going through our subjective experience, whether that be the cultural norms that we were taught, our level of education, our senses, how we see, feel, touch, taste, you know. And so this is kind of a revolutionary idea because even in the field of disability studies and fighting for like disabled people's rights, it denormalizes what we all think is normal. Like the way I see is normal, therefore a person with vision, of some sort of vision disability, even something like color blindness, is not the norm. But really, it's just a different way of seeing, literally seeing our environment, going through the subjective experience. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but how this relates to the illusion of absolutes. Order, chaos ad infinitum, this idea, how it relates to magic is putting your intention out into the universe and being able to in a co-creative relationship with the universe. So going back to empowering the individual, this is the idea behind magic, that I, as a person, the student witch, can send my intention out into the universe and create effective change that I want, right?
Exactly. And don't think that you are powerless because
Right.
with the concept of feedback,
Exactly.
every intention could get amplified.
Yes, with the concept of feedback, you send your intention out into the universe,
Exactly.
and it becomes amplified, and it does affect change.
Now, another important thing, and actually, oh man, we don't have the book.
Which one?
The book you gave me to read that I was reading the other day. Another important thing is like sometimes you have to understand when you do magic, right? Well, I'm not an expert in this field, but for what I read, sometimes the outcome of that magic is not. It doesn't exactly match what you were expecting.
Think it was gonna be. Exactly, and that's the chaotic element right
Exactly,
there.
exactly.
You can't predict, you can't 100% predict the outcome of an intention or a phenomenon.
Right? That's why it's so important to actually not to do unethical magic.
Right. That leads into the questions of ethics and magic, which is a whole other video. This order, and chaos, thinking in terms of a duality versus a dichotomy, accepting that change is real and inevitable, accepting chaos, accepting uncertainty is actually very liberating. Very liberating.
That's a very beautiful way to say it.
And also seeing that the magic or your intention that is put out into the universe is actually very powerful for you as the individual, because the individual can affect change within systems, is also very liberating and powerful. But it also forces you to be responsible, to take responsibility for what you do and accept consequences. This line of thinking, for me personally, has helped me to become a more mature person, a more mature witch. The last question is, and this actually comes up at the very end of the documentary, is there a consciousness behind the universe then? If this is just a self-replicating cyclical system of order and chaos and order and chaos, does that mean that there isn't some sort of singular consciousness behind this order and chaos? Or is there a different way that we can conceive of consciousness? But we're kind of trying to wrap our own heads around it, because I'm still not 100% sure of what I think about it, right?
At the end of the documentary, they present a very interesting experiment. The scientific tried to simulate the mechanisms of evolution in a computer.
Mm-hmm.
So the scientist doing that says, at some point mentioned and said, so this really destroyed the idea of a creator or a designer, because you don't need anybody to intervene here.
Right.
These creatures, or this mechanism of evolution work perfectly in the computer simulation. Which it's I don't know how to say it. I kind of half agree with what he's saying.
Right.
One problem is all the scientists forget this, or most of them most of them forget the researcher.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very important ingredient in the research.
Right. The subjective, going back to this radical constructivism idea, the researcher conducting the experiment.
Exactly. This guy
has an impact on the outcome of the experiment. So that kind of leads us to the question of, to the idea. So if we're taking the metaphor of the researcher setting up the experiment in the computer to mimic the process of evolution, on a bigger scale, there would be the consciousness that set up the order chaos ad infinitum universe that we live in, right? So is that like a deist idea? That kind of 18th century idea that God, he just put the clock together and just let it go? Or is that consciousness, does that continue to have influence over the outcomes of this order chaos cycle beyond just setting it up and letting it go?
Right.
That's my question. The way that I'm trying to wrap my head around it, and I haven't completely developed this idea, is if there is this consciousness that not only set up, a consciousness that not only set up the system, but also permeates the system. If that consciousness completely permeates the system, that means I am part of that consciousness. And chaos theory is often associated with fractals, and fractals have the what's it called, where the part represents the whole?
Self-similarity.
The self-similarity principle, where the branch of the tree is a smaller scale image of the whole tree. That's the idea of self-similarity. So, thinking in those terms, my consciousness is, according to self-similarity,
At a smaller scale.
a smaller scale of the greater consciousness.
The universal, yeah.
The
that's
universal
beautiful.
consciousness. That is in everything and everyone.
Exactly,
At least that's what I
exactly.
believe. So that's how I'm beginning to wrap my head around it.
Right. I mean, I don't wanna like go into the creator, that there is a creator. I don't wanna like fall into the image of like this anthropomorphized creature creating the world.
Yeah, we're
right?
definitely trying not to. That's another
Wow.
reason why we make the disclaimer when we talk about the sacred or the divine masculine and feminine. We're not trying to anthropomorphize this idea of consciousness or deity, whatever you want to call it. Which, on the one hand, I kind of understand anthropomorphizing it because it brings it down to earth and puts it in very human, understandable terms that we can have very simple or very easy access to and emotional connections with. So I'm not putting down the more theistic pagans who do have altars to Hecate, for example. I'm not putting that down. I'm just saying we need to remember that we are simplifying a phenomenon when we do anthropomorphize.
It's much more complex.
It's much more complex than just putting everything in human terms, right? So
let's not forget it's a metaphor.
it's a metaphor.
So coming back to the scientific guy that was doing that evolutionary experiment in the computer.
In the documentary, yeah.
As a metaphor again. So the guy claims, well, so this system works itself.
Right, the system
And evolution
itself.
works itself, so like it comes. But he's forgetting that his intentions were in this thing. There is an intention, there is a direction, right? A conscious direction. So all that intention, there was a direction of all this action, the conscious direction, this masculine principle there, right? That gives, that channel the energies, right? That thing he completely erased it from.
Right, so he's forgetting his subjective input in the phenomenon that he was trying to measure. Which brings us to, well, I wanted to mention how a lot of people who are kind of familiar with quantum physics or theoretical physics and how they've already seen that the observer of a phenomenon actually has an impact on the outcome. That famous experiment when they were trying to shoot the photons through the slot, and depending on if the observer was watching or not, the photon acted as either a particle or a wave. So the role of the observer and the subjective intention of the observer, finally, theoretical and quantum physics has realized that. But let's not forget, magic and witchcraft and these other kind of alternative philosophies that have been undervalued by things like the Newtonian paradigm or Western modernity. We've known this shit. Exactly. We've known this shit all along. So I just wanted to push that in there. Just because science says it doesn't mean it's finally legit, you know.
So finally, well, the lesson is we see this duality in the universe. This duality that balance each other out. That at least in mathematical terms is what they're starting to call order and chaos. Right. What you may call in more
like esoteric or magical thought.
Right. School. Right. That you would call the masculine and the female principle.
Yeah, the divine or sacred masculine and feminine, or God and goddess, or deity, spirit. Yeah.
So let's embrace it, because it's impossible to have certainties. And actually, uncertainties, chaos, brings flexibility, and it brings the possibility of change.
And change can be good.
And change can be good. Exactly.
So anyway, how did we come to these conclusions? What did we read to get to these conclusions and these observations? And how do we conceive the relationship between order and chaos? Because I've mentioned this book. I actually have a review of this book, Gloria Anzaldua's La Frontera. And she talks about duality. She's specifically, when she talks about Coatlicue, an Aztec goddess that she connects with. And when she's talking about duality, the goddess is the goddess of both birth and death. Life and death. She gives life, but she also takes it away. So how do we understand that duality in a very monotheistic, absolute, Western paradigm kind of world? And she says, duality, the goddess represents duality, the synthesis of duality, and something more than just the mere synthesis of duality. So when we try to understand, so order and chaos is the interchanging, interacting duality. But how do we understand this duality in terms of a whole? And different schools of thought, or different sources of knowledge, I'm going to call it different things. And Anzaldúa kind of leaves it mysterious. It's something more than just the synthesis of duality. Orion Foxwood, in The Flame and the Cauldron, calls it the Ancient One, the source of the duality, the divine masculine and feminine. He's read this book. I haven't read it yet, but I will very soon.
It's a very good book.
Jesus and the Lost Goddess. It's about the early Christians and more Gnostic thought on Christianity, which reads the story of the Christ as a metaphor instead of literal history.
Yeah. To explore the beliefs of Gnostic beliefs, at the same time they give you a very good summary of history.
Right.
How Gnostic thought was wiped out.
Right, and how actually the divine feminine principle was completely wiped out of Christianity. Actually wiped out of
everything.
All the monotheistic paradigms. So anyway, so in here, in Gnostic thought, it's conceived of...
You have God, the goddess, which is the primordial duality.
The primordial duality.
Exactly.
Which is the great mystery of how God and goddess come together.
The great mystery is whatever precedes this primordial duality.
Right.
The unreachable.
The unreachable state that we have no idea. It's kind of like the moment before the Big Bang, if you want to think in more like...
Or what Anzaldúa was saying,
terms.
more than the synthesis.
Yeah. Right. The great mystery is, how does this duality of order and chaos, divine masculine and feminine, come together to form a whole, and what the hell is that whole? The great mystery, the Ancient One, something more than just the synthesis of duality. And also, in alchemy,
for those who like alchemy,
for those who are into alchemy, he's read this book, which I am going to read very soon as well. Mm-hmm. The Sorcerer's Stone, A Beginner's Guide to Alchemy.
So again, here we find this primordial duality as the masculine and female principle. Mm-hmm. And how the idea of alchemy is to perform the great work, mm-hmm. that at the end is symbolized with the hermaphrodite.
The hermaphrodite, which is the sacred marriage, right?
Between the masculine principle and the female principle.
Right. So different schools of thought, alchemy, Gnosticism, old world or old style witchery and new world witchcraft, and even post-colonial border theory talk about this duality, the whole of order and chaos, as something that we're still trying to figure out, which again, being okay with uncertainty. Uncertainty can be beautiful and liberating.
And we need both.
And we need both. Exactly.
There is such a thing as too much chaos, and there is such a thing as too much order.
Exactly. You need both. Oh,
it's
and
more complicated with two people.
Sources on chaos. Although, are these kind of heavy in math?
Yes, I would say for those who want like to explore a more mathematical idea, you can read. This is a very good introductory book to non-linear dynamics and chaos. It's very interesting how chaos appears in non-linear dynamics.
Right.
Totally opposite to the linear thinking that we were talking
But
about.
it is kind of math heavy.
Yeah, it's math heavy.
I wouldn't be able to understand this book.
Right.
So that's why I'm glad he read it and he can just explain it to me. So.
Right.
And the other book?
Oh, but this one it's even more.
This is more math dense.
But it's more about chaos. It's more specific about chaos. The other one was also about non-linear dynamics. This is more specific about chaos. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a hold of this. But it's even more
math dense.
Exactly.
I was flipping through it before we filmed, and I was just like, I don't know.
I have trouble to following something, but I mean to get the general idea.
Right, but if you have a high level of Western European mathematical knowledge,
you might enjoy also these.
You might be able to get those books. Okay, I think we've talked for long enough, right?
I think so.
Okay, see you guys later.